What if everything you thought you knew about the first death in human history was wrong? You've heard the story of Adam and Eve, but there's a mystery hidden in the Bible that most people completely overlook. Who died first? Adam or Eve? The answer isn't just surprising. It changes everything we understand about God's plan, biblical truth, and the spiritual battle that has been raging since the beginning of time. This isn't just a historical question. It's about your faith, your destiny, and the ultimate truth about life and death. What happened to the first humans still affects us today, and by the end of this video, you'll see why understanding this hidden revelation is crucial for your spiritual awakening. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover might shake your entire understanding of God's message and the eternal consequences of sin. Before we dive in, take a moment to check. Are you subscribed to this channel? Many people who watch our videos love learning about the gospel of Christ but forget to subscribe. If you believe in Jesus Christ and want to uncover more powerful biblical truths like this, hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss the revelations we share here. And let me ask you, who do you think died first, Adam or Eve? Drop your answer in the comments, and let's see if you already know the shocking truth hidden in Scripture. Death. It's the one certainty that every human must face, yet it remains the greatest source of fear and uncertainty. No wealth, no power, no earthly status can outrun its reach. Kings and beggars, rulers and servants, the rich and the poor, all meet the same fate in the end. But it wasn't always this way. When God created Adam and Eve, death was not part of the plan. They were formed with divine hands, placed in a paradise where eternity was within their grasp. Imagine that. Life untouched by suffering, free from sickness, where every moment was filled with the presence of God, and yet they lost it all. Think about this. What if death was never meant to be? The Christian faith teaches that God designed humanity for something far greater. Adam and Eve were given God's message directly. They were not created for decay or destruction, but for an existence that reflected His perfection. They had everything: love, security, dominion over all creation, and the promise of eternal life. There was no disease, no pain, no fear of an ending. They were meant to walk with God, not hide from Him. And yet, despite all they had, one decision changed everything. It all comes down to trust. When God speaks, His words are truth. Yet humanity, from the very beginning, has struggled to believe that His plan is truly for our good. Adam and Eve were given a simple command, a single boundary in a garden overflowing with abundance. They had biblical truth before them, yet a whisper of doubt led them astray. And isn't that the same battle we face today? How often do people question God's plan, thinking, there must be something better beyond His will? They chase wealth, status, and fleeting pleasures, believing these things will bring fulfillment, only to find themselves empty, restless, longing for something deeper. And so, death entered the world, not just as an ending of life, but as a separation from the divine. The moment sin entered, so did fear, suffering, and the relentless passage of time. What was once eternal became temporary. What was once peaceful became filled with anxiety. But here's the most profound truth. Death is not the final word. From the very beginning, God had a plan, a gospel of Christ that would one day restore what was lost. But before we can understand that redemption, we must first understand the fall. Imagine a world where everything is perfect. No pain, no sorrow, no struggle. Just the purest form of life, filled with peace and the presence of God. This was Eden, a paradise handcrafted by the Creator Himself, where Adam and Eve lived in harmony with nature and, more importantly, in direct communion with God's message. They lacked nothing. Every fruit, every tree, every moment was an endless testimony of God's plan for humanity. A life of abundance, joy, and eternal fellowship with Him. But despite all this, something happened that changed the course of history forever. It all began with a lie. Not an obvious, blatant deception, but a subtle distortion of truth. The enemy didn't force Adam and Eve to sin. He simply planted a seed of doubt. Did God really say? That one question was enough to unravel everything. Eve was deceived, convinced that there was something greater beyond the boundaries God had set. She believed the forbidden fruit would open her eyes, give her wisdom, and elevate her beyond what God had already provided. But isn't this the same deception that still misleads people today? The idea that faith in God isn't enough, that they need to chase after something more. Wealth, power, control, only to realize too late that It was all an illusion. The moment they ate the fruit, something profound happened. They did gain knowledge, but not the kind they expected. Instead of enlightenment, they felt shame. Instead of power, they felt fear. Biblical truth had been exchanged for deception, and the consequences were immediate. For the first time, they saw themselves as vulnerable, exposed. They had been covered by God's glory, but now, stripped of that protection, they desperately tried to cover themselves with fig leaves. Feeble attempts to hide what only God could truly restore. The tragedy? Humanity has been doing the same thing ever since, trying to cover up brokenness with temporary fixes instead of returning to the source of life. And then, the most heartbreaking moment of all, they heard God walking in the garden. But instead of running to him, they hid. The very presence that once brought them joy now filled them with dread. Spiritual awakening was replaced by spiritual death. And that, right there, is the greatest tragedy of the fall. Not just the loss of paradise, but the loss of relationship with God. But even in this moment of despair, God was already setting the stage for redemption. Because though sin brought separation, Jesus Christ would one day bring restoration. But before we get there, we need to understand the first true death in human history. Death didn't arrive as a sudden event. It crept in, silently, like a shadow stretching across the soul of humanity. The moment Adam and Eve took that bite, something inside them withered. The first death wasn't physical, it was spiritual. The connection between them and God's message was severed. What was once an intimate relationship became distant, clouded by guilt and fear. They were still breathing, but they were no longer truly alive. And isn't that the same reality for so many today? Walking through life physically whole, yet spiritually lifeless, disconnected from God's plan, chasing meaning in all the wrong places. But here's the terrifying truth. Spiritual death always leads to physical death. When God warned Adam, "For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die," Genesis 2:17, he wasn't just speaking of the body, he was speaking of something deeper. The very fabric of existence had changed. Suffering, sickness, aging, none of these were part of God's plan for humanity. They were the natural consequences of separation from him. From that moment forward, every human born into this world inherited the same condition, physically alive, but spiritually distant from the gospel of Christ. And then, the curse took hold. Adam and Eve were cast out of paradise, barred from the tree of life, ensuring that death would become an unavoidable fate. The Garden of Eden was no longer their home. Instead, they entered a world of toil, hardship, and decay. And just like that, the countdown began. The first generation of humanity was now bound to an inescapable truth. Faith in God was no longer just an option. It was the only way to restore what had been lost. But would they learn from their mistake? Or would the cycle of sin continue? Because here's the thing. Death wasn't finished yet. The first true, recorded death in human history wasn't Adam's, and it wasn't Eve's. It was something far more tragic. It wasn't just the loss of life. It was the first time a human hand took another human life. And that brings us to the heartbreaking story of Cain and Abel. From the moment sin entered the world, it brought consequences that rippled through every generation. Eve was deceived, believing that disobedience would bring wisdom, power, and enlightenment. Instead, it led to loss, shame, and suffering. The same lie that led her to take the forbidden fruit still echoes in the world today. The idea that rebellion against God's plan will lead to something better. But sin never delivers what it promises. It always takes more than it gives. What looked like freedom became bondage, and what seemed like knowledge became confusion. The curse fell upon them both. Eve would now know pain in childbirth, a reminder that life would come at a cost. Her role as the mother of humanity was no longer one of effortless joy, but of suffering and sorrow. Adam, too, bore the weight of their decision. The very ground that once flourished under his care would now resist him. Work, which was meant to be fulfilling, became laborious. The food he once gathered freely would now require toil and sweat. The perfection they had known was gone, replaced by a struggle for survival. And in the end, their bodies, once made for eternity, would return to the dust. But the worst consequence wasn't physical, it was spiritual. For the first time, there was a rift between humanity and God. Where there had once been trust in Jesus, in his eternal plan, in his perfect provision, there was now doubt, fear, and separation. And isn't that the very battle people still fight today? So many seek to fill that void with success, relationships, wealth, believing that something in this world can satisfy the soul. But no amount of effort can undo the consequence of sin. Biblical truth is clear. There is no restoration apart from God. Yet even in their brokenness, God did not abandon them. The curse was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of redemption. Because in the midst of judgment, a promise was spoken. A prophecy that one day, a descendant of Eve would crush the serpent's head. Genesis 3:15. A gospel of Christ in its earliest form. A whisper of hope that, though death had entered the world, it would not have the final word. But before redemption could unfold, the weight of sin would continue to grow, leading to the first bloodshed, the first murder, and a tragedy that would haunt humanity forever. Sin had entered the world, and its effects were undeniable. Adam and Eve stood outside the garden, their once perfect existence now shattered by the weight of their disobedience. But something remarkable happened. Even in their failure, God's plan for redemption was already in motion. Instead of leaving them exposed in their shame, God did something they could never have expected. He clothed them, but not with fig leaves. No, those were human efforts, fragile and temporary. God provided garments of skin, and for that to happen, something had to die. This was the first recorded sacrifice, a foreshadowing of what was to come. Blood was shed so that Adam and Eve could be covered. And doesn't that point directly to the ultimate sacrifice? From the very beginning, biblical truth was clear. Sin carries a cost, and that cost is life. Yet, in His mercy, God provided a substitute. What He did for Adam and Eve was more than an act of compassion. It was a prophecy, a glimpse of a future where the gospel of Christ would be fulfilled in the most profound way, through the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. Think about this. Adam and Eve had never seen death before. They had never witnessed suffering, never felt loss. But now, for the first time, they saw the consequences of sin firsthand. An innocent life had to be taken to cover their failure. And isn't that what still happens today? Humanity constantly tries to cover its own mistakes, through self-justification, through wealth, through accomplishments, but nothing truly restores what was lost. Only God can provide the covering that we need, and that covering comes through faith in God's message of salvation. But this was only the beginning. Though they were clothed, their exile from Eden remained. Their lives had changed forever. And outside the garden, a world of suffering awaited them. Yet even in this painful reality, a promise remained. A Redeemer was coming. But before that promise could be fulfilled, the consequences of sin would unfold in an even more devastating way. Through the first murder in human history, the gates of Eden had closed behind them. What was once a paradise, overflowing with God's plan, had become a distant memory. Adam and Eve now faced a harsh new reality, a world where survival was no longer effortless. The vibrant colors of the garden had faded into the wilderness, where the land resisted them at every turn. Every meal required labor. Every day carried the weight of what they had lost. And in their hearts, they knew their greatest sorrow was not the hardship, but the absence of God's presence as they had once known it. Still, even in exile, God's mercy remained. Though Eden was lost, God's message was not. His voice still reached them, though from a distance. And isn't that the same experience so many have today? Longing for something more, feeling the ache of separation, searching for meaning beyond the toil of everyday life? The struggle Adam and Eve faced wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. They had once walked in perfect unity with God, and now, for the first time, they had to seek Him. They had to learn what faith in God truly meant, not as a privilege of Eden, but as a necessity for survival. Generations would come from them, but the curse of sin would linger. As they worked the land, raised their children, and tried to rebuild a life outside of paradise, the weight of their decision remained. They had seen the cost of disobedience. They had witnessed the first sacrifice, and they knew death was no longer just an idea. It was a reality waiting at the end of their journey. But would their children learn from their mistakes? Would their descendants understand that true fulfillment was not in working the land, but in seeking the gospel of Christ that had been whispered from the beginning? Because before death would claim Adam or Eve, something even more tragic would happen. Sin would not stop at exile. It would not stop at suffering. It would continue to grow, to consume, until it reached its next inevitable form: brother turning against brother. The first true human death was coming, and it wouldn't be from old age. It would be from something much darker. Sin had already shattered the perfection of Eden, but its destruction was far from over. Adam and Eve had hoped that their children would find their way back to God's plan, that maybe, through them, the promise of redemption would come. But what they didn't know was that sin, once unleashed, would not remain passive. It would grow. It would take root in the human heart. And soon, it would lead to something even more devastating. The first murder in history. Cain and Abel were born into a world that their parents barely recognized. No longer surrounded by paradise, they had to learn what it meant to survive in a fallen world. Cain became a worker of the land, toiling under the curse placed upon the earth. Abel became a shepherd, tending to his flocks. And then came the moment that revealed what was hidden in their hearts, their offerings to God. Abel brought the best of what he had, a blood sacrifice, reflecting true faith in God. Cain, however, gave an offering that lacked devotion, and God saw the difference, not in the gift itself, but in the heart behind it. Jealousy began to fester in Cain. Instead of humbling himself, instead of asking how he could be right with God, he let bitterness consume him. God's message was clear. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? Genesis 4:7. But Cain didn't want redemption. He wanted revenge. And so, in a moment of rage, he called Abel into the field. No one knows what was said, but what we do know is this. Cain raised his hand against his brother and ended his life. The first human death was not by disease, accident, or natural causes. It was an act of violence. A life taken by the very hands that were meant to work the earth, now stained with blood. Imagine Adam and Eve's grief. They had lost one son to death and the other to exile. Cain was marked and sent away, cursed to wander, forever bearing the weight of his crime. And in that moment, they must have realized this was the true consequence of their fall. Sin had not only separated them from God, it had torn apart their family. Faith in God had been replaced with jealousy, love with hatred, and life with death. And though Abel's blood cried out from the ground, there was still a greater cry, a promise that one day another innocent life would be taken. But this time, not in anger, but in sacrifice. A life that would be given to break the curse once and for all. Time moved forward, but the scars of the past remained. Adam had lived through centuries of hardship, watching the world change before his eyes. He had once walked with God in perfect unity, but now he lived under the weight of the curse. For 930 years he witnessed the unfolding consequences of sin, violence, suffering, and the slow decay of humanity. What had once been a perfect creation was now marred by struggle. And though he had lived longer than any man today could imagine, he knew one thing with certainty: his time would come to an end. Yet in all those centuries, the Bible is silent about Eve's death. We know when Adam passed, but not when or how Eve's life ended. Did she go before him, leaving him to walk the earth alone, carrying the grief of their shared mistake? Or did she outlive him, watching as the first man ever created breathed his last breath and returned to the dust from which he came? Biblical truth does not give us this answer, and perhaps that silence speaks louder than any recorded words. Because in the end, the real question was never about who died first, but why death had come at all. Through those 930 years, Adam must have thought about Eden every single day. The beauty, the peace, the life that had once been his, now a distant memory. He saw generation after generation walk the same path of rebellion, just as he had. He watched humanity chase after wealth, power, and security, believing they could find fulfillment outside of God's message. And perhaps, in his final days, he realized the greatest lesson of all: no amount of time can undo the consequence of sin. Only faith in God could bring true restoration. And so, the first man died. Adam, the one formed by God's own hands, returned to dust. The very thing God had warned him about had come to pass, and with his final breath, he left behind not just a family, but a legacy, a story that would be told for generations, a testimony of both failure and hope. But death was not the end of the story, because even as Adam's body lay in the earth, God's plan for redemption was still unfolding. A promise had been given: a Redeemer would come, and one day, death itself would be defeated. Now that you know the truth, let me ask you, did this revelation change the way you see the story of Adam and Eve? What part of this message spoke to you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments because I'd love to hear your perspective. And before you go, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. Many people miss life-changing biblical insights just because they're not subscribed. Don't let that be you. Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss the next powerful message. Speaking of that, there's another video on your screen right now that dives even deeper into biblical mysteries. Click on it and keep uncovering the hidden truths of God's Word. See you in the next one.